Welcome to the Morning Glory Project, Stories of Determination. I'm your host, Betsy Graziani Fossbender. Like in nature, we see determined flowers and vines clinging to life and seeking light. So are Morning Glory people. And in this podcast, I'll interview writers, activists, artists, entrepreneurs, survivors and thrivers, and trailblazers of all kinds. These are folks that have been determined to get over, under, around, and through the obstacles that face them, or to seize the opportunities that come before them. I find these people inspiring and amazing. I know you will too. Maureen Langan is an award-winning stand-up comic and radio talk show host. Her quick wit and honest rants on life's absurdities make her a hit at clubs, theaters, and festivals across the U.S., Canada, Europe, and South Africa. Maureen is also a journalist and a seasoned television and radio broadcaster. San Francisco Bay Area listeners may remember her program, Hangin' with Langan. It used to be on KGO Radio in San Francisco. And she was subsequently an anchor for PBS and Bloomberg Television and Radio. She was awarded the title of Best Female Commentator by the Newswomen's Club of New York. Her solo show, Daughter of a Garbageman, is a one-woman tour de force, and it has received many, many awards across the country and internationally. In this show, Maureen shares in equal parts the funny and the heartbreaking experiences of growing up in a working-class family, peppered by alcoholism and soothed with humor and abiding love. Maureen, thank you so much for being part of the Morning Glory Project today.
I'm glad that we can finally connect. Yay.
Maureen, I was lucky enough to be in the audience of Daughter of a Garbageman, your one-woman show. And of course it's funny. You're a comedian, right? It was delightful and we had a great time. But it's also more than that. And it's a story of great tenacity and perseverance on your part, coming from where you came from to where you are now. And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to talk a bit about that. What really got you to write such a show? What prompted you to write about your family?
Yeah, the show is funny, Daughter of a Garbageman, and thank you for saying that. And I am a comedian, but part of the reason I wrote this show is because funny is one level of who I am. There's also the emotional, there's the writer, there's the connector and the communicator. So it isn't a comedy. It is a true solo show with all those layers, and I'm glad you got to see it. Listen, it's a very vulnerable thing to do. And I grew up one of 6 children in a town called Lake Hiawatha, New Jersey, where there's no lake. And I know for me at least, when you grow up surrounded by a lot of inconsistency and some violence and alcoholism and everybody's in their corner kind of fending for themselves. Yeah, you have good things, of course, too. But there's this part of you that doesn't feel free to speak because you don't know what that's going to elicit. What kind of anger that'll elicit.
So it's not a very predictable environment?
Predictable is the perfect way. And who has predictability, really? But yeah, a lot of people don't understand when they have that stability, what a gift that is. And when you don't, you have to find it on your own. I mean, listen, my mother was great and she was a rock for all of us and we got our education. And my father's funny as hell and has a big heart and very forgiving. But I think for me as an adult, it's interesting that I do radio, television, comedy, and write a one-person show. For many, maybe it's ego-driven, and I'm sure partly it is for me, but it's really a need to speak and not have the crap beat out of me.
Personally, I don't think of it as an ego-driven thing at all. I tend to think of storytelling as just a really innately human need. Different people tell their stories in different ways, of course. They're painters and artists and musicians and storytellers and writers, and you tell your story through comedy, and it didn't seem at all ego-driven. In fact, if that were the case, I don't think I'd have invited you here.
It's a very emotional show to do, and sometimes I find myself backing away from it, whereas my fella, the Sicilian, is always saying to me, keep moving ahead with it, but it is vulnerable.
Yeah, I understand this. I'm a memoir writer, and so to have a book of your life out there, there might be some parallels in our existence, but, I don't hover over people when they're reading the book. You're standing right in front of the audience as you're telling your story. That seems like, of course, it feels pretty vulnerable.
Betsy, I saw you read an excerpt from your book. What is it, The Silver Cup? What is it, your book called?
Well, actually, The Silver Cup is the title of a story that's published in an anthology called Shades of Blue. My memoir is filling her shoes. But yes, I thank you so much for saying so. It's a very vulnerable thing to do, to tell your life story and to show it to the world. Both your pain and your worry and your heartbreak. Yeah, that's a risk.
If you tell your truth in today's world and somebody doesn't like the words you use, they will come up to you. I said the word fat, that my father looks like a blend of Archie Bunker, Fred Sanford, and Marlon Brando, the early years, not the fat years. The man became heavy afterwards, and he was a very handsome younger man. Maybe people found him handsome in his older years, but my father looked like him in the early years. So some woman said, why did you have to say the fat years? I said, because he was fat.
You're right. Even the words that we choose matter. Of course, we don't want to use vulgarities or racist terms when they're inappropriate or anything like that. But gosh, it must be really vulnerable to be a comedian and to have to choose your words so carefully. And sharing humor, too, has got to be pretty vulnerable. I mean, what if it's not funny? What if people are offended? What if they don't laugh? I try to imagine what it's like to stand in front of a room full of hundreds of people and perform your life story. I read just a piece of my life story, and it's a nerve-wracking thing to be so vulnerable. What I really admired about the show, Maureen, was that you don't sugarcoat, you don't hold back, you don't make the alcoholism or other mayhem from your father and other members of your family invisible, but you also don't villainize anybody. You don't look at them with bitterness.
Years of therapy, my dear. But, I interviewed, when I was a journalist years ago at Bloomberg, I interviewed Frank McCourt of Angeles Ashes. But I remember when I interviewed Frank before he won the Pulitzer Prize. So I was interviewing him, and he had a horrific childhood. Frank McCourt in Ireland, Angeles Ashes, the whole thing. And, his father was not nearly as kind or loving as mine. And he was saying that he looks at his father like a shamrock. There's three, cloves, 3 leaves, 3 clover, whatever the heck you call it, 3 leaves on the shamrock, parts to it. And 2 of them, in his father's case, were not good. And 1 was okay, could do some nice things. For me, it's 2 are very kind and loving, and 1 doesn't do such great things. So you have to look at it as a whole. And that always stayed with me. And I also, too, listen, when you grow up that way, you want things to be good. So you want to find the good. It propels you. It keeps you connected. Because to disconnect fully from one's family, that's a very challenging thing to do. When you become an adult, you disconnect in healthy ways and you know how to do that. But also, too, it's not like when you grow up with a man who's very loving and very funny, that's just part of it. It's not like you have to read that on a screen or figure that out. He's a very forgiving, loving person. So I hope that part of that I have. So that's a good thing. And I hope I don't have the rage and the alcoholism. Aren't we all human beings? What are we going to do?
So I'm going to state the obvious here, but clearly humor has been an important part of, I don't know if you want to say how you coped or healed or endured, or how you just got through difficult circumstances, and perhaps how others in your family did as well. Can you say a little bit about the role of humor in your family?
I actually think it's actually the town I grew up in. We were all a bunch of wise asses and quick wit, and you wanted to be the first. It's always he who laughs last thinks slowest. So the first one in, it's a boxing match. It's a verbal, mental sparring. And I don't think it was just my family. I think it was all around me growing up. But 2, you had 6 kids. You had to get in and out real fast. Go. And, everybody's funny and has a sense of humor, but it really wasn't happy fun. Like, ooh, everyone's like, 6 kids, that must have been fun. Oh, yeah, it was great fun. They're all great. We're all great, but, it's not great growing up with, people sometimes go, oh my God, 6 kids. It must have been so fun around Christmas. Or you guys around the dinner table. Like, what are you talking about? People project like this,
sort of like the Waltons or Leave It to Beaver or something.
We kind of were when it came to like everybody wanting more food and it wasn't there, but that's because you have 3 huge brothers who eat it all. So I think everybody has a sense of humor, and I think it's just an Irish trait. I don't think it's a coping. Maybe you use it to cope, but it's just the way you think. It's the way you speak. It's just humor is very much part of the Irish tradition, I think.
Yeah, it seems common in Irish families, but I can also say that I've talked to folks from Jewish families. I come from a big Italian family, and humor was a big part of our culture, as well as coping through the difficult times as well.
Yeah?
Yeah, and it wasn't even just humor. It was also about storytelling. You know, you had to elbow your way in. I'm one of 5, like you're one of 6. And storytelling was a big part of the family culture as well. I'm not sure if that storytelling was about coping so much as it was about connecting and keeping each other entertained and being part of the family. And even though yours is Irish and mine's Italian, it seems like there's some similarities there.
Yeah, I have one brother who's like the best storyteller. He could be, if he wanted to go down the acting path, he could have been famous. He's like Vince Vaughn, just so funny and quick and great at storytelling. But, you know, I always say, you know, we would have had a sense of humor. I like to think if there were no alcoholism in the family, I like to think I'd be funny even if I didn't have dark things to be funny about, right? I mean, you know, the silliness, ridiculousness. People set you up. Like we just found out my boyfriend, he's an adult, a grown man. His whole life, he's half Sicilian Catholic. And he was like, oh, my mother wasn't into religion. I don't know, she was just Romanian, French. We just found out he is 49% European Jewish. His whole life. He didn't know this till 6 weeks ago. So you get set up for a joke and you're like, you know what? He goes, wow, what do you think of this, Maureen? I go, I think yesterday I was a bitch. Today I'm anti-Semitic. Like, you just get set up for the joke. It's not like you're looking for it. It's given to you on a platter. What are you going to do?
Of course. How could you not swing at that one?
You know, you're on a baseball team. The ball comes, you have to hit it. That's all it is. That's what comedy is and humor is. It comes at you. What are you going to do?
Well, I believe you and. I say and because I think of your humor in your show a little bit like I do an artist like, say, Richard Pryor, who had this magnificent ability of making people laugh, of course, but then touching their heart in a really interesting way. And you'd almost feel a little bit badly for laughing at what was funny, and then he'd touch your heart, and then he'd make you laugh again. And I saw that quality in your show of being able to go to find the humor in the darkness and to bring that out and make you feel, you didn't make us feel bad, of course, but touch the heart and then add the funny. And there was that beautiful mix there for you. You had this way of sandwiching the dark moments between the light ones. And that's what made the show inspiring.
Well, I was very aware that, wow, this is a very deep scene. Let's get out of here with some humor. Let's go in with humor. Let's get out with humor. Because people have to know you're okay when you're sharing your story. If you're sharing your story and you're up there and you can't function, like, you can't do that to people. I mean, you can't put them through that.
This is true in writing, too, it seems. You know, the dark and the light. And it seems like when you're writing or telling a story, part of the idea is giving folks the idea that you can make it through, right?
I think, you know what, that's good, because the vulnerability of doing it, that sounds like, oh, the vulnerability of doing it. Look, there's a scene when I got very sick when I was a teenager, for those listening, and it's very frightening for me to talk about it. And I feel so scared. I literally feel, I can remember the feelings of being 13 and 14 years old and going through it. And when you go through that, you're like, why am I sharing this? What am I doing? Why do I need to do this? And you want to stop. And honestly, there are times I go, get off the stage, and we just walk out, give them their money back, and leave. No joke. In my head, I can picture that happening. And I go through it, and I think what's so startling for me afterwards, truly, is that people come up and they hug you and they go, oh my God, thank you. You're like, wow, really? Oh, okay. Wow. All right. You don't realize that other people it really taps into others' humanity. And ultimately that's what we have is at our core, right? Is each other and what we go through and connecting.
Gosh, Maureen, that's exactly why I so believe in storytelling. I think that's how we connect to our deepest humanity. That's why I write stories and help people write them. And that's why I started this little project, is to share these stories. I think that storytelling is how we build empathy between us human beings, one to another. We listen to each other's stories, and either we feel similarly because we've been through something similar, or we feel empathy because we wonder, what would I do if I was in that same circumstance? Storytelling, to me, builds the bridges between us. And it doesn't seem to matter what color you are, or how much money you have, or what country you're from. It just seems like storytelling breaks down all of those barriers.
You know, that's a beautiful way of putting it. It's funny, you were talking earlier about, you put things out there, and I want to say this because this is important. I feel today there's so much political correctness that one can't speak freely. And I think it's essential to speak as that person would have spoken, to use their words with honesty and integrity. And I can see there's a moment in the audience when I said my dad is a blend of Archie Bunker, Fred Sanford, and Marlon Brando, the early years, not the fat years. My father's a man who still calls people colored, but in a good way, if that's at all possible. And then I go into show how he would use that growing up. And I go, we don't call people that, Dad, anymore. Well, what are you talking about? I just told you a funny story. You took the good out of it. Don't make me hate you. So to him, it was a word of, that was his friend who was a colored friend that he grew up with, that he worked with. So for him, there was no negative connotation in it. And even though life has moved forward, I would be doing a disservice if I didn't use the language that he used and the real connection or the interaction we had following that.
Yeah. If you sanitize it, it doesn't feel authentic.
I can't do that. And I think words are really important. And if people had used worse words, that I feel that it is, if I'm going to tell the truth, I have to tell the truth. And that's the part I can feel the audience get a little when I go, my father's a man who still calls people colored. I can feel the energy pull out, but in a good way, if that's at all possible, because that's absurd that's in a good way. But to him it was, but today it wouldn't be. So
yeah, I don't really like the term political correctness because it sounds a lot like a bunch of rules. But I do think that when we look back, we can't measure every bit of vocabulary of yesterday by the yardstick of today. And what you do in that example that you share is you're talking about not just the vocabulary that your dad used in this case, and you're not excusing racism if it were present in somebody, but you're talking about his intention and his heart and not just his words that he used. Of course, if somebody was blatantly racist or cruel or ugly or discriminatory in the past, we'd measure that by a different kind of yardstick. That, of course, we need to judge, but this feels a little different than that. And by telling the story as you have, you're not saying that it's okay to use those terms today. You're comporting in a way with political correctness. You're saying we know differently now, and I try to correct my dad, but that's who he was. And you acknowledge that those words wouldn't be okay today. They're offensive to many folks, but that your dad wasn't evil at the time that he was using them, unlike other folks that may have not even used those same words, but could have been evil in their behavior. That there were folks back then that did evil things, and your dad wasn't exactly one of them.
And even if he were, and say he went around screaming horrible racial terms, I would want to be honest about that. Because it's truth. And we're at a time now, I'm even sometimes with stand-up afraid, I go only to a certain level with it because everybody's recorded. Everything's out of context. You can't make mistakes. You can't say things that you go, oh, that was beneath me. I wish I didn't say that. And then not use it the next time.
Yeah, I think about people like you, Maureen, and I think, gosh, being a comedian is already sort of walking a bit of a tightrope anyway. So I'm curious what it is in you that despite all of the hazards that you're talking about that still makes you want to do this. What do you think drives you to do it?
Well, doing stand-up is it's fun. It's just really fun. Mostly it's fun. There are times it's not, but it's fun and it's enjoyable to be able to get up there and connect and laugh. And it's like a ringmaster of sorts in a certain way. There's a sense of control. There's a sense of one-way communication. So you get to speak your truth. You have the microphone. And again, that's a bit of a rebel because when you grow up and you can't speak freely, though there is the inhibitions now that, there's a lot of sexism and ageism in the business. That's just the way it is. Also ageism for men and women. But the thing is, you want to be able to speak freely, and I would like to be able to speak even more freely. It's just a lot of pressure these days. So I think it's not doing justice to the creativity of comedy.
Well, you're an outspoken person, not just in your comedy, but about news events, world events, local events, political. And I'm wondering, it just seems like you're a kind of person that says, I just have to say something about this.
Yeah, and a couple things. One is, again, we go back to not being able to speak freely. So having the right to do that is wonderful. It's just a great feeling. On the other hand, I think my mind, I have a friendship that sadly frayed during these political times because she was like, why do you have to question things? You're always that way. Like, that's how you are. And all this came out. I never knew she felt this way after decades. You always just have to question and wonder why and ask, who cares? What do you care why I think that way or feel that way? And I didn't realize that was something that offended her. I thought, wow, I want to know more about you, and I want to know why that makes you click and why you support that and where are you coming from with that.
So you saw it as curiosity and wanting to understand your friend, and she saw it as intrusion. Why do you need to ask that stuff? She was thinking you just need to accept things the way that they are.
Yeah, it was, and that was like, I am that way. Like, I guess she thought I would be defensive. I said, no, I am, because I'm just curious. I want to know what makes you tick with that. She goes, why do you have to know? It's not your business. Who cares? And it's just some political stuff. She made statements, and I just said, can you explain to me why you feel that way? No, I don't have to defend myself. Like, well, why do you feel like you have to defend yourself? I just want to understand. See, there you go. I'm like, oh my God. Oh no.
So Maureen, you keep coming back to something that I think is really important. And you talk about not having had the freedom to speak up, not having been free to express yourself. And whether one comes from a family where that's the case, where it's perhaps not safe either emotionally or sometimes physically to do that, you can risk being harmed or ostracized, or whether you come from a social class or a country or a culture where that's the case, it can be difficult to find a way to find your own voice. It seems to me that you've, in a way, embraced the First Amendment on about 100 levels. You've taken that freedom of voice in your personal conversations, and your political ones, and your comedic ones, and your social ones. It just seems like that's a really important quality that you have. That's part of why I think of you as a morning glory. It's that persistence of wanting to express yourself, that tenacity of voice. I'm sure that as a woman and in comedy that you've certainly had barriers you had to overcome, and this is part of why I see you as such a blossom in this way. Can you say a bit about that?
Well, first I want to say to you that I feel that I have not bloomed to the fullest because I still recoil when I put ideas out there or question or express myself, because that's why I think it's safer having that almost in a lot of ways one way, talking to the audience, talking whether it be in radio or stand up or my one person show, because it's safe.
Isn't it does it strike you as kind of ironic that on one hand you've talked about how vulnerable it feels to be out there on stage and telling your truth, and on the other hand it also feels like it's powerful and that you're in control? So it's kind of an interesting paradox, a place where you feel simultaneously vulnerable and safe.
Yes. The one-person show is very frightening because it's so vulnerable, and I'm outing other people's secrets. And a certain family is supposed to be loyal, and I am loyal, but there's a difference between loyalty and codependence. But the thing about broadcasting that's troubling me right now is I worked at KGO for 7 years, and there was 8 million management changes and program directors. And while I have the journalism background, and that's what I came up through, because I'm funny, even though I'm probably not too funny on your show today, but I feel that sometimes I'm dismissed because I don't take myself as seriously as some people will. I don't go, I read this and you should know according to chapter 2, verse 3. I'm just more like, oh my God, I read the book somewhere in chapter 2 or 3. You got to read this, you guys. It's insane. So that's how I would come across doing the same. Like when I did the Mueller report, when that came out, I read every bit of it, and I had to fill in for somebody who was very, very, took himself so seriously. And he was mortified that I had to fill in for him. Because they don't know the depth, because I tend to not.
So do you think it's because you have a funny exterior that they don't know that you've got some depth and thoughtfulness behind that?
Some do, but not the last regime. And it's interesting because I worked at one place where somebody else was supposed to fill in, and I filled in at the last moment. And the original host who was out had notes for the fill-in about what to talk about and how to say it, and that person's taken much more seriously. It's so hysterical. There's all so much BS that goes on behind the in the backgrounds of places, and I find that people some people want you to put on airs. Listen, I worked for Bloomberg for years, and he's like, God, she's the only one with a sense of humor around here. What do you want to do, Langan? You know? So there are people who really appreciate that, the rebel within and people beating to their own drummer. And there are other organizations that just don't have that ability. And I think today, particularly with what's going on politically, the fact that there are so few women in the administration and on TV and radio, really in full capacities to share their opinions and have talk shows, particularly in radio, especially in radio, it really worries me. It worries me a lot.
So, Maureen, I'm just so impressed with how many ways you have found to be a storyteller, as a writer, as a comedian, producing a one-woman show, as a journalist, as a talk show host, and even gracing this new little podcast by being a guest on here. I'm so grateful that you would do that. I so appreciate you coming on, and I find you plenty funny.
Well, you ain't seen nothing yet, honey.
So, Maureen, I have one more question for you that may seem like a silly one, and particularly for those who haven't been to Maureen's show. You have a quote in the show, and in fact, you have buttons made that say, "Love your guts." And it's how I actually picked up those buttons and how I knew to reach you, because it had your website on it and everything. And I wonder if you'd be willing to share with our listeners what "love your guts" means in your family.
Well, when I was growing up, I'd say to my father, when you're a kid, "I hate your guts." And he'd go, "Yeah, but I love your guts." And he'd be like, "Oh, that's disgusting." He goes, "Well, if I love you, I have to love all of you, your guts included." And you make me emotional. But I know for me that's really about ourselves, about our family. For me, daughter of a Garbageman, that's about my dad. If I love him, I have to love all of him, and guts included. And we have to love people for who they fully are, with their ickiness and their wonderfulness. And that's what "love your guts" means to me.
I found that so touching, the whole idea of loving somebody complete with their icky parts, or maybe partly because of that too. And it was a moving part of your story. It's part of what I see as your quality of being able to love the whole person and not do so with resentment. It's a very touching experience in your show, and to have you here. I'm very grateful that you would be part of the Morning Glory Project.
Well, Betsy, I want to say something to you before I say goodbye to you, if that's okay. One is, I want people to love me for my guts, too, because I am hugely imperfect. And when you have that, that's such a blessing. And the other thing is the work you're doing. I love that you're doing this. I love that you are going deep into people and bringing them on your air and showing their humanity, and you're showing yours through your creativity. And I applaud you for that.
Thank you. I just really appreciate that. And thanks for being such a beautiful bloom. Today's extra blooms when I think of Maureen Langan, both her show and her conversation with me here on this program. She's able to look back at her family and to embrace all the parts of it, the humor, the love, and not to gloss over what's difficult in her family. And particularly in her one-woman show, she shares that. I hope that you'll get a chance to see her. And if she comes to anywhere near you, I certainly suggest it. But the real extra bloom is that kind of love your guts notion of loving somebody with their flaws, recognizing our imperfections, and not looking just at the dark. That's a big lifesaver for lots of us that have to look backwards at difficult relationships, sometimes difficult family members, and to still take the good stuff with us to go. Thanks so much for listening to the Morning Glory Project today. And if you've enjoyed this episode, don't hesitate to spread the word a little bit, share it with others, and give us a 5-star somewhere, wherever you get your podcast. That helps us get listened to. Thanks for listening today, and I hope to talk to you next time. Go out and bloom.